by the content of his character, Dr. Martin Luther King and the Civil Rights Movement. In the American Civil Rights Movement, many brave men and women took a stand and contributed to what would become one of the biggest cultural steps forward that the United States has ever seen. African Americans who had been oppressed and harshly mistreated by their white neighbors for almost a century after the end of the Civil War decided to stand up and expose themselves to hatred, violence, and even death to win equality and civil rights for their people. Many individuals, such as Rosa Parks, the Little Rock Nine, and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., all played key roles in the expansion of political and social rights for African Americans. Of all these heroes, Dr. King stood above them all in the eyes of many. He was a pastor who believed in peace and nonviolence. He wanted a colorblind nation where people would be judged by their character rather than by their race or religion. His lofty ideals and his high hopes for the United States as a nation were embodied in his now world-famous "I Have a Dream" speech during the 1963 March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. Dr. Martin Luther King, more than any other civil rights leader, was the driving force of the civil rights movement, and his "I Have a Dream" speech was a turning point in the movement, which continued to gain momentum until his tragic assassination at the hands of James Earl Ray. Before Martin Luther King's "I Have a Dream" speech, peaceful protesters in the civil rights movement had suffered incredible levels of violence at the hands of white Southerners, many of whom were law enforcement officials. During the early years of the movement, many Southern cities were shrouded with violence as excessive police brutality, beatings by Klan members, dousings by fire hoses, and attacks by dogs were unleashed on the peaceful African American protesters and any that were members of the protests. One of these horrifying acts of violence was the church bombing at the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, Alabama, that killed 5 young girls on their way to Sunday school class. Assistant Shelby County District Attorney John Campbell had some important insights regarding the levels of violence during the civil rights movement. On August 28, 1963, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. stood in front of the Lincoln Memorial and delivered a 17-minute speech in which he called for an end to racism and in a nonviolent way. In this speech, he said that he wanted his children not to be judged, not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. He was one of the keynote speakers for the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, which was a peaceful demonstration for the civil rights occurring in the nation's capital, a defining and powerful moment of the American civil rights movement. He perceptively referenced the Emancipation Proclamation, issued by Abraham Lincoln during the American Civil War, and inquired why, 100 years later, the Negro is not free. He delivered this speech to over 200,000 people, and captivated the world with his inspirational positions and his demanding but reassuring voice, advising all to take a step to loving their neighbor regardless of what color his or her skin may be. The response to King's speech was astounding. His heartfelt and bold attack on racism struck a chord with white Northerners, and many of them for the first time began to feel shame for what they had allowed to happen in their country. At first, many considered it the height of the march and the height of Kennedy's presidency, saying that he brought all African Americans together, peacefully, to bring change to this great nation. Not all of the response to the speech were positive, however. To many in the government, like J. Edward Hoover, King was a supposed threat to the security of the United States. King was consistently sent letters by the FBI and government officials saying that he would eventually pay the price for rallying the country behind the cause of African American civil rights. The threats finally came true when King was shot on the balcony of the Lorraine Motel in Memphis, Tennessee, by James Earl Ray. Dr. Martin Luther King was the driving force of the American civil rights movement, and his "I Have a Dream" speech was a turning point in the undertaking, until his disheartening murder by James Earl Ray. The speech captivated millions, pricked the conscience of the nation, and still stands as one of the most famous and powerful speeches in American history. Dr. King's dream came true, and he, more than any other person, was able to get African American and whites to band together and love one another, in order to form a more perfect union in the country where all men are created equal.